The next thing we need to talk about as you're developing your sports newscast is writing the story and also how to make all of those stories flow together. As a producer, you obviously are going to be responsible for a good deal of the writing. Writing for broadcast is very different from writing for print, so we need to talk a little bit about how to do this. 3 things to keep in mind. Number 1, avoid extraneous words. Your audience can only absorb so much, so fast, so you don't want to confuse them. To that end, number 2, avoid stretching out the story. If it is a brief, make it a brief. No sense trying to get someone on the scene for a live report for the Chiefs' 7th round draft pick, unless of course he is from your coverage area. And number 3, read, and reread to look for unnecessary words, facts, and information. Remember, efficiency means being tight, so keep your stories tight, and thus efficient. Now, as you're writing the individual stories, 5 things to look at on which we'll spend a little more time is the length, the form, supporting the lead, information selection, and making sense. When it comes to story length, consider competing stories and the length of the entire newscast. In terms of competing stories, decisions must be made to determine which stories deserve more time, especially when only a few minutes are allotted to each newscast. On average, readers are 20 to 25 seconds, while packages are about 90 seconds. As for the length of the entire newscast, sometimes you're going to be writing a 30-minute sports page or campus chatter. Other times you'll have a 2-minute segment in the evening news. Keep in mind that this is one way the internet and the multimedia mindset helps. You can always tell the audience where to go for more information. Now let's talk a little about story form. First, forget inverted pyramid. This is used in print journalism where we get the most important information first, less important information toward the end. In broadcast, you want to build to a climax in order to sustain audiences and their level of interest. A broadcast audience encompasses listeners, whether they are watching and listening or just watching. Number 3 on our list of things to look at is how you are going to support the lead of your story. In some cases, such as a brief reader, the lead is the entire story. Other times you're going to need some supporting information from the story. This will be the case in your longer readers and in your packages. But do still keep in mind information selection is critical because you won't have time to say it all. You've got to pick and choose. It is possible to deliver the entire story in only a few sentences. How? Well, one thing to do is to stick to the basics. Answer the basic questions an audience has. The 5 W's. Who, what, when, where, why. And don't forget how if it's relevant. Also consider these 2 questions. Why do you want to tell the story? And is it newsworthy? When making these decisions, keep in mind the story's importance and interest. If it is unusual and thus will pique curiosity, if it involves controversy, if it is timely, and if it has proximity, meaning it is happening in or involves somebody in your coverage area. And finally, you don't want to confuse your audience when you write, so make sure you are making sense. Use pertinent facts, but only use them if it is completely necessary. It doesn't matter if your new left-handed pitcher broke a toe when he was a freshman in high school and missed the season. It does matter if he had Tommy John surgery. You also need to explain and clarify info that could confuse audiences. If you cover NASCAR, you need to take the time to detail the new scoring rules, or at least give an overview, and again, tell them to check the website for full details. Also, finish one point before moving on to the next. Nothing will confuse an audience more than if you are discussing UConn's win streak. You start talking about the Huskies' rivalry with Tennessee, and then you come back to the win streak. Now keep in mind, in order to know the pertinent facts, explain clearly, and keep to the key points, you're going to have to do your research. Often writers will have to write about topics they may not be familiar with. And also never assume just because you have been following this story for a long time, your audience has been following it as well. You need to give the backstory to set up the facts that you're giving in this story. Now let's talk a little about story flow. Remember, you are writing a story, but you are inserting that story into an entire sportscast. So you need to think about the flow of each individual story, but also how they flow together. 4 things to keep in mind to help your story flow and also help your newscast flow are organization, transitions, the use of snappers, and rhythm. When you organize and write your stories, look for related ideas. Again, don't throw in extraneous info, but rather move from an idea to a related idea. You also can look at sequencing and see if the elements in your story can be organized chronologically. And also think about indexing, that blatant stating of first, second, next, and so on. This can control info in some stories, but it's very boring if used all the time, so use it judiciously. Another thing to think about is transitions. These help you relate thoughts and sentences. It also helps you relate stories. If you use what's called an umbrella lead, you can sometimes put two stories into one. For example, you could write one story about a Mules football player who got drafted and another story about a player who signed a free agent contract, but why not lead with two former Mules football players are taking their games to the next level, and then give the facts about each player within the same story. This is really useful when you have no time for both stories, but your transitions are critical. Something like, while Tyler found out on day one he was going to the Bears, Aaron had to wait until after the draft to learn of his NFL fate. That way you use your umbrella lead to talk about Tyler and Aaron. You first talk about Tyler being drafted, and then you make that transition, and now finish your story talking about how Aaron was signed as a free agent. Another way to ensure flow is to use snappers. A snapper is the last sentence in a broadcast story. They're the second most important part of the story, after the lead, because they wrap up the story. You can use the snapper as the main point when you want to wrap up or reinforce the story's main point. You can also save a snapper for additional piece of information. This is where you might be telling the story of a spring training opening with pitchers and catchers, and your snapper would be the rest of the team reports to camp Monday as they make another run at the World Series. Finally, your snapper can provide the other side as you seek to balance controversial stories. Something like, however, while doctors have found no correlation between concussions and mental health, the NFLPA is skeptical and says it will begin its own investigation. It is important to be careful with this approach, as the introduction of new information may be confusing to add at the end of a story. And finally, it's important to find rhythm in your sports writing. How? Well, one, think about the sentence length. Short, incomplete sentences can add power and immediate interest, but use them sparingly. You don't want to get into a rhythm of short sentence after short sentence after short sentence. 2, consider your sentence structure. Subject-verb structure is fine. Stay active. 3, use strong words. Get to love your dictionary and thesaurus. Become familiar with powerful words. We want to avoid adjectives and adverbs and use more active verbs. And 4, use repetition appropriately. The same word used too often can lessen the power of a story, but then again, sometimes it can enhance a story by clarifying ideas. For example, Joseph Randle used to run from linebackers. Today he is running from the law. See what I did there? So now if you apply these tips, you will be able to write efficiently and tightly, making your stories more interesting for broadcast and also easier to understand for your audience, and you will have nice flow throughout the entirety of your sportscast.